Hello, this is Dan Buchanan, the history guy of Brighton, Ontario. Welcome to Brighton in the 1850s, A Time of Change. These videos were produced in April 2021, but they utilize an audio recording of the first presentation of this topic that took place at Hilton Township Hall in August 2013. At that time, I was experimenting with digital dictation devices, and this seemed a perfect event to record. 8 years later, when I listened to the recordings again, it was obvious they were a resource I could use. After this brief introduction, you will hear my voice in audio clips from the event in 2013, and you will see images related to the ideas being discussed. Many of the images were in the original presentation, and some have been added to enhance the videos. Before we get started, I want to mention that this event in 2013 was one of two events held on successive Sundays. The 1850s talk was the first event on August 11th, and the second event on the 18th featured a display of the Latimer photos in Hilton Hall. All 270 plus photos were laid out on tables, and people from the community were invited to review them. The history guy was there to answer questions and print particular photos on request. We had two very good events. I recall visiting with my sister Mary Lou after the 1850s event. And for much of the Latimer Photos event, I was at my computer looking up information and printing photos. As a historian, I was enthusiastic about the information presented in the original 1850s talk, and now I'm happy to provide the same Brighton history to a wider audience in the form of videos. I hope you enjoy the videos, and always remember that the history guy appreciates feedback of all kinds from any of his history work. So, feel free to comment.
Today I'm going to talk about the 1850s, a time of change. I'm going to start off with this statement. The decades of the 1850s was the most intensive period of change in the history of this community. Now, I, like many of you, lived in this area around the 1950s and 60s. So, I may have some discussion on this point. But I'm going to go through all the major items of changes that happened here during that short period of time and indicate how they might have changed the lives of the people here and how important they were. Changes, lots of changes. Responsible government came to Canada in 1849. Brighton Township was created January 1st, 1852. The breakaway happened there April 21st, 1852. The Brighton-Seymour Gravel Road was built 1853 to 56. The Grand Trunk Railway was built at the same time, 1853 to 1856. During this whole time, the lumber business was booming, and wheat was a terrific cash crop. On the social side, we had the Dr. King story, which is well known in this area, who poisoned his wife and was hung in 1859. And the Brighton Village then separated from Brighton Township, which created some interesting results. So those are the major items we're going to touch on. Responsible government. Okay, what is responsible government? Well, I'm no political scientist, but I'll explain it this way. We can go down the road to our polling station and cast a vote and elect someone to go up to Toronto and sit in the legislature. Modern democratic government, that person is responsible for the interests of the people that voted for them. But not only that, that responsibility is supposed to go up the levels of government. Up and down the levels of government. We can argue about different parties and people and issues, but that's fundamentally what's supposed to happen. Before 1849, that's not the government we had here. We had a colonial government. The folks that lived here, they could get on their horses and go down the road and go to the polling station. They could vote for a local person to go sit in the legislature. There was dozens of them that went up to sit in the legislature. But they had a very low ceiling. The folks above him, the lieutenant governor, he was appointed by a bunch of rich politicians in London, England. He had their interests in mind, not the folks who voted for the folks that came to the legislature. He appointed a cabinet of guys that were going to agree with him. So the folks who voted didn't see their interests being met. And so by the 1840s, this became known by the people in Ontario and Quebec as being not the right way to go forward. They could see that the development in their communities was not being done enough. The developments were not happening. They couldn't get agreement on things that they knew they needed in their local communities. And so finally, in 1848, they had an election, and the Reform Party finally won, after 30 years of struggle. The story of Robert Baldwin and Hippolyte Lafontaine in Quebec, the two of them took 3 decades fighting for responsible government. And finally, they won by a landslide. The people finally realized they needed reform. The ministry was called the Great Ministry because of the amount of legislation it passed. Within 18 months, it passed a huge amount of legislation that changed the playing field for governance in this country. Just a couple of the main ones here. The Corporations Act. This meant that every municipality, every town, village, county, township was made into a corporation, was incorporated, with all the benefits and tools for financial administration and administration that was in that, and the obligations for that too, for accountability. That really changed things dramatically in terms of what local government could do. The Elections Act was really important because elections in this country in the 1840s were brutal. You know, we listen to the news about elections in Africa and other places and think, oh, tut-tut. Well, back in those days, the elections here were governed based on money and liquor. And, you know, if you could spend enough money to get enough toughs out there to intimidate people, you could get elected. So it went a long way to curbing that. The Elections Act, Edgerton Ryerson was the author of the Elections Act. We understand him to be the author of the public school system in Ontario. Actually, he wrote the first draft of this act, showed it to Baldwin, and Baldwin was just aghast. He couldn't pass that. It was far too radical for even the reformers of the time to pass. So back to the drawing board, they rewrote it and got something that the reform people at the time could pass, and we know Edgerton Ryerson as the father of public schools. The Universities Act is important because it dealt with the secondary school education and basically took the conferring of degrees and diplomas and made that secular, made that under the government as opposed to under the religious institutions. They could still have their institutions, but the conferring of diplomas and degrees. There's lots of others, but that was the important thing that changed. Of course, the Navigation Act opened ports in the colonies, in British colonies, to non-British ships. That was part of the reforms that were going on from the British end of things. So these were broad changes, not just for this local area. So how is this people in the local area would have been affected? Well, I think they would have seen fairly quickly, and we'll see some of these things, that they were now able to go and make decisions in their own community to do what they needed to do to improve their own lives, their own facilities in their own community. And I think the other thing that was important, that they would start to understand that they were being treated a bit more fairly by their government. That was a very important problem that they saw dealing with the previous type of government. They just didn't feel they were being treated fairly. And that's an important emotion to have in the community. So responsible government was really important to change the governance system.